until you make the unconscious conscious. It will direct your life, and you will call it fate. Have you ever met someone and felt, within minutes, like you already knew them, before they had said anything revealing, before there was any real information to base that feeling on? Not comfort, exactly. Something closer to recognition. The sense that some part of you had been waiting for this specific person to walk into the room. Here is the contradiction worth sitting with. The person who makes you feel most alive is sometimes the same person who reaches, unerringly, for the exact place in you that hurts the most. Not through cruelty, necessarily. Sometimes without doing anything at all except existing in a particular way, saying a particular kind of thing, being warm and then distant, in a rhythm that somehow feels less like chaos and more like a language you already understand fluently, though you couldn't say where you learned it. Why would the nervous system respond this way? Why does someone clearly wrong for you sometimes feel more right than someone who is simply straightforwardly good to you? And what if the pull you're feeling was never entirely about them in the first place? There is a mechanism operating underneath conscious choice in these situations. One Carl Jung spent much of his career trying to map, and it rarely announces itself directly. It works quietly, underneath the story you're telling yourself about chemistry, about compatibility, about finally meeting someone who gets you, and by the time you notice something is repeating, you're usually already several months or several years into the pattern. Jung used the word projection for one piece of this mechanism, the process by which a person unconsciously locates something belonging to their own inner world, a quality, a wound, an unmet need, in someone else entirely, and then experiences that located material as though it were simply a fact about the other person. This is not lying to yourself in any deliberate sense. It happens beneath the threshold of awareness, which is precisely what makes it so difficult to catch in the moment it's occurring. There's a distinction worth making early, because it gets collapsed constantly, and collapsing it is where most of the confusion in this subject actually begins. Familiarity and compatibility are not the same thing, and they can feel, from the inside, almost identical. Compatibility is built from evidence. It's the accumulation of actual, observed information, how someone handles conflict, whether their words match their actions over time, whether being around them leaves you steadier or more depleted. Familiarity is built from something else entirely, a felt sense that this dynamic is known to you, that you understand its rhythm without having to think about it. The trouble is that familiarity can come from two very different sources, and only one of them is good news. Sometimes you feel familiar with someone because the relationship genuinely resembles other healthy connections you've had. And sometimes you feel familiar with someone because the relationship resembles an old, unresolved emotional pattern, one your nervous system recognizes instantly, not because it's good for you, but because it's known. Picture someone who meets a person and feels, almost immediately, "I feel like I've known them forever." That sentence gets treated, culturally, as one of the highest compliments a connection can receive. But it deserves a second look before being trusted uncritically, because the feeling of having known someone forever can be generated by an actual, healthy resonance, or it can be generated by walking straight back into a dynamic you've walked into before, dressed in a different face. The feeling itself doesn't tell you which one is happening. Only time and honest attention can do that. So what exactly are you responding to when you say you have chemistry with someone? This is a genuinely harder question than it sounds. Some of what registers as chemistry is simple: uncomplicated compatibility, shared humor, aligned values, and ease in each other's presence. But some of what registers as chemistry, particularly the kind that arrives instantly and with unusual intensity, is something else entirely, a cocktail of anticipation, uncertainty, and unresolved tension that the body reads as excitement, because uncertainty and excitement produce remarkably similar physiological signatures. The racing heart before a text arrives, the heightened attention when someone's mood is difficult to predict. These sensations feel like passion. Structurally, they are closer to vigilance. Consider two people, One is stable, communicative, consistent, someone who says what they mean and means what they say. The other is unpredictable, warm in bursts, followed by stretches of distance that are never quite explained. For a person whose emotional system was calibrated early to treat unpredictability as significant, the stable person can produce something close to nothing, a flatness that gets quietly mistaken for lack of connection, while the unpredictable person produces a near constant hum of activation that gets mistaken for deep, undeniable chemistry. What if calm feels boring, not because it actually is boring, but because chaos is what your emotional system was trained a long time ago to recognize as significant? This isn't a universal law. Plenty of people feel calm and simply feel calm, without any complicated history attached to it. But for those where this pattern applies, it explains something that otherwise seems irrational, choosing, again and again, the person who keeps you slightly off balance over the person who doesn't. This is where projection deserves a fuller look, because most explanations of it stay too abstract to be useful. How do we fall in love with an image of someone, rather than the actual person in front of us? It happens through a mechanism almost embarrassingly simple once it's named. The mind fills gaps. When you don't have enough information about someone, and early attraction almost never comes with enough information, the mind does not sit patiently in that uncertainty. It fills the empty space with material of its own. Imagined depth, imagined understanding, imagined potential, borrowed almost entirely from your own inner world, rather than from anything the other person has actually demonstrated. Picture someone who has exchanged a handful of conversations with a new person, someone genuinely interesting, genuinely worth getting to know, and already, within days, an entire emotional narrative has been constructed. Who this person is at their core, how deeply they'll eventually understand you, what kind of future this could become. Ask honestly, how much of that story was built from evidence, and how much was supplied by the imagination, reaching into the gaps and filling them with exactly what it needed to find there. This is not a character flaw. It is, in fact, how imagination and hope operate in any early relationship. But it becomes worth examining closely when the story being constructed starts to feel more vivid, more emotionally significant than the actual limited evidence available would reasonably justify. Jung had a related concept here worth introducing carefully, because it gets misused constantly. He wrote about an inner image each person carries, an unconscious sense of what a deeply significant other might look and feel like, built from early relationships, culture, temperament, and unmet longing. He called the specific expressions of this the anima and animus, and while his own descriptions of them were shaped by the gender assumptions of his era and shouldn't be treated as fixed truths today, the broader idea underneath them still holds up, that people sometimes encounter another person and experience a disproportionate, almost symbolic significance attached to them, not because of who that person actually is, but because they happen to activate this pre-existing inner image. When that activation occurs, the other person can start to feel less like an individual being, gotten to know, and more like the arrival of something you've been unconsciously anticipating your whole life. That feeling is genuinely intense. It is not, on its own, reliable evidence that the relationship is right. The shadow adds another layer worth developing further, because it explains a specific kind of fascination that otherwise seems strange. The shadow, in Jung's framework, holds the parts of a person that were disowned, not because they were inherently bad, but because they were, at some point, deemed unacceptable to express openly. And the shadow does not simply vanish once it's exiled. It goes looking for a place to be witnessed, and one of its favorite places is other people. Someone who learned early that anger wasn't safe to express may find themselves oddly fascinated by people with an easy, unapologetic confidence, drawn to it in a way that goes beyond ordinary admiration. Someone who learned to make themselves smaller to avoid threatening others may become quietly obsessed with people who take up space without a flicker of guilt. Someone who was taught that wanting things too openly made them needy may find themselves unable to stop thinking about a person who expresses desire without any apparent shame attached to it. Someone who learned early that their own sexuality had to be muted or hidden may feel an intensity around people who express theirs freely that goes far beyond simple attraction. In each case, what's actually happening is not necessarily about the other person's objective qualities. It's recognition, the disowned part of the self, responding to someone who is living openly, a permission the person watching was never given. What if part of what draws you to someone is a part of yourself you have never been allowed to fully exist as? This doesn't mean the other person isn't genuinely attractive, genuinely worth wanting. It means the attraction is carrying more than one message at once, and only one of those messages is actually about them. There's a pattern this eventually produces that deserves its own close look, because it's one of the more disorienting experiences people have without ever connecting the dots. Picture someone years into adulthood who has dated a series of people, different in almost every visible way. Different appearances, different careers, different personalities entirely. And yet, somehow, the emotional experience inside each relationship keeps arriving at the same destination, the same anxious waiting for a text, the same slow escalation of chasing, the same eventual, familiar disappointment. If the people keep changing but the emotional story stays exactly the same, what exactly is repeating? It isn't the individuals. It's the underlying complex, the emotionally charged, semi-autonomous pattern organized around an old, unresolved theme. And a complex does not require a specific person to activate it. It only requires someone who resembles, closely enough, the original shape it was built around. And the resemblance is often not physical or even circumstantial. It's emotional, a particular way of being warm and then withdrawing, a particular quality of being just slightly out of reach, and the complex, encountering that resemblance, responds the same way every time, regardless of the name attached to the face in front of it. This raises a genuinely uncomfortable question worth sitting with directly. Why does rejection sometimes make attraction stronger instead of weaker? Ordinary logic predicts the opposite. But for a complex organized around inconsistent or conditional love, rejection isn't simply painful. It's familiar in a way that deepens the pull rather than reducing it, because it reactivates the exact emotional territory the complex has always circled. The anxious, urgent hope of finally becoming the one who earns consistency from someone who has never quite offered it before. It's worth being careful here, because not every instance of wanting someone more after rejection is pathological. Sometimes rejection simply clarifies genuine interest that was already present. The pattern worth examining is specifically the kind where the wanting escalates dramatically, disproportionately, in a way that feels less like continued interest and more like a compulsion that arrived the moment the door started closing. Underneath that compulsion is often a question worth asking honestly, even though the honest answer can be uncomfortable to sit with. Do you want the person, specifically, as they actually are? Or do you want the emotional resolution that winning them would represent? The proof, finally, that you are enough to make someone who withholds finally stop withholding. This connects directly to something worth naming as its own subject, because it rarely gets discussed with enough nuance, and that is idealization. What happens when a person falls in love not with who someone actually is, but with who they could become, if they finally opened up, finally became consistent, finally became the version that's been sensed somewhere underneath the current behavior as a real possibility. You don't love who they are yet, the internal story goes. You love who they could become. Once enough patience, enough understanding, enough of your particular brand of care is finally offered. This is one of the more seductive forms projection takes, because it doesn't require ignoring reality entirely. It requires selectively focusing on potential while quietly setting the current, actual evidence to the side. Ask honestly, when you remove everything you're hoping this person will eventually become, what is actually left in front of you right now? Sometimes the answer is still someone genuinely worth being with. Sometimes the answer is uncomfortably thin, a handful of promising qualities surrounded by a great deal of imagined future doing most of the emotional work. There's a distinction worth making explicit here between anxiety and intimacy, because they can feel remarkably similar from the inside and produce very different long-term outcomes. Being activated by someone, the racing thoughts, the preoccupation, the inability to stop checking your phone can feel like evidence of deep connection. Sometimes it is. But activation and genuine closeness are not the same phenomenon, and telling them apart requires a slightly different question than, how intensely do I feel this? It requires asking, do I feel more like myself around this person or less? Anxiety tends to narrow a person, pulling attention obsessively toward the other person's next move. Real intimacy tends to widen a person, creating enough safety that attention can actually rest, rather than remaining in a constant state of monitoring. This distinction isn't absolute. Healthy relationships have anxious moments too, particularly early on. But when the anxious activation is the primary, near-constant texture of a connection, it's worth asking honestly whether what's being felt is passion or vigilance wearing passion's clothing. This is why emotional safety can, counterintuitively, feel unfamiliar at first, even unwelcome, to someone whose system was calibrated around unpredictability. Picture meeting someone who communicates clearly, follows through on what they say, doesn't disappear for days without explanation, doesn't play the small strategic games that keep the other person slightly uncertain. And instead of relief, there's a strange flatness, an underwhelmed feeling that's difficult to name, sometimes even mistaken for lack of attraction altogether. Why can safety initially register as absence rather than as the relief it actually represents? Because for a nervous system trained on unpredictability, calm doesn't register as connection. It registers as nothing happening, simply because nothing happening was never the environment it learned to read as meaningful. This doesn't mean the discomfort lasts forever. For many people, it fades with enough repeated exposure to consistency, the system gradually updating its definition of what safety actually feels like. But the initial underwhelm is worth naming honestly, rather than treat it as proof the stable person is simply wrong for you. Dreams deserve a fuller look here as well, because Jung considered them one of the more direct available channels into material the conscious mind hasn't yet processed, especially around new or intensifying attractions. Someone might notice a recurring dream about searching for a person who's always just out of reach, a dream about a door that won't open no matter how many times it's tried, a dream about returning, again and again, to the same unfamiliar house, looking for someone who's never quite there when the search finally arrives. Or, more disorienting still, a dream where the specific face keeps changing, a different person each time, but the emotional feeling underneath the dream stays exactly, unmistakably the same. This isn't a call to treat dreams as a fixed code, where one specific image always means one specific thing. Jung was explicit that dream material is deeply personal, tied to each individual's own associations rather than any universal dictionary. What matters is simply taking the recurrence seriously, noticing what emotional territory keeps resurfacing, and treating that as information worth sitting with, rather than dismissing as unrelated noise generated by an otherwise unremarkable night's sleep. There is a particular moment worth examining closely, because it is, in many ways, the most revealing point in this entire subject, and that is what happens when the projection breaks. It doesn't always happen dramatically. Sometimes it happens quietly, almost without warning, a single ordinary moment where the person you've been imagining and the person actually standing in front of you suddenly, unmistakably, stop matching. They say something small and disappointing. They fail to rise to a moment you'd unconsciously built an entire story around. And for a moment, something genuinely disorienting happens. Not simply disappointment, but a kind of vertigo, the sense that the person you've been building an entire emotional life around has, in some sense, just been momentarily replaced by someone considerably more ordinary. What happens when the person you imagined finally becomes the person actually standing in front of you? For some relationships, This moment is the beginning of something more honest and more durable, the fantasy dissolving to make room for an actual, imperfect, real connection, which can hold considerably more over time than the projection ever could, precisely because it's built on something true. For other relationships, this same moment reveals that very little was actually there beneath the projection, that the fascination was carried almost entirely by the imagined version, and that the real person, once finally seen clearly, simply isn't who the story required them to be. Neither outcome should be treated as a failure of the person doing the projecting. Projection is not a flaw to be eliminated. It is, in Jung's view, simply how early attraction operates for nearly everyone, a normal, human process of reaching into uncertainty and filling it with hope. What matters is not preventing projection from ever happening. What matters is noticing, honestly, when it's happening, and staying curious enough to let reality eventually correct it, rather than defending the fantasy against the evidence indefinitely. This is where individuation becomes genuinely useful, rather than simply an abstract term borrowed from an old psychology textbook. Individuation isn't becoming perfect. It isn't healing every wound so thoroughly that old patterns simply stop existing. It is the slow, ongoing process of becoming conscious of the different parts operating inside you, the complex, the shadow material, the inner image doing its quiet work in the background, and learning to relate to them deliberately instead of being steered by them without realizing a choice was ever available. The goal was never to stop being attracted to complicated, difficult, intense people entirely. Some of the most meaningful connections a person builds do involve real intensity, real complexity, real depth. The goal is considerably more modest and considerably more useful, becoming conscious enough, when that intensity arrives, to actually understand what it's doing inside you before letting it make every decision on your behalf. Toward that, a handful of questions worth sitting with quietly, not as a checklist to complete, but as an invitation to look a little closer at whatever's currently pulling at you. What specifically about this person feels familiar, and can you trace that familiarity back to anything or anyone earlier in your life? What do you actually know about them, built from real evidence, versus what you've quietly imagined and filled in yourself? What happens inside you, specifically, in the moments they pull away, and does that feeling have a history that predates them? Have you felt this particular shape of longing before, with a different name attached to it? What qualities in them do you find yourself unable to stop thinking about? And is it possible those same qualities exist somewhere inside you, underdeveloped or quietly disowned? And perhaps the most revealing question of all, would you still want this person, with this same intensity, if they became completely, consistently available tomorrow? Or is some part of what you actually want the specific, familiar feeling of finally being chosen by someone who has always made that uncertain? So, why are you attracted to people who trigger your deepest wounds? The honest answer is more layered than any single sentence can hold, and it resists the kind of tidy explanation this subject often gets reduced to online. Sometimes attraction really is simply attraction, uncomplicated and exactly what it appears to be. But sometimes, attraction carries considerably more than desire inside it. It can carry memory, projection, an old, unconscious familiarity mistaken for chemistry, a disowned part of yourself, finally glimpsed in someone else's freedom to be it openly. An unfinished emotional story, quietly hoping this next person might be the one who finally completes it. Becoming conscious of these forces doesn't mean eliminating attraction or approaching every future connection with clinical suspicion instead of feeling. It means gaining enough awareness, over time, to tell the difference between two sentences that can feel, in the moment, disturbingly identical. This person is right for me. And this person has awakened something in me that I still need to understand. What if the person you couldn't stop thinking about wasn't only revealing who you wanted, but revealing something inside yourself that had been quietly waiting for a long time to finally be seen? Sometimes the person who changes your life is not the person who stays. Sometimes they are simply the one who reveals what you were still carrying, all along, without ever quite knowing its name. If any part of this felt like it was describing something closer to home than expected, there's more of this kind of looking inward, waiting here on inward, whenever you're ready to keep going.